Let's close out chapter 9. Chapter 10 is going to get us into part of how Paul reads the Old Testament, as well as the discussion of the Lord's Supper. But the end of chapter 9 concerns something we talked about already, which is, especially yesterday afternoon, what the role of suffering or discipline or pain is in a Christian life. Not something to be wondered at, but something to be embraced and used. So he says this in 9:24, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it." This is exhortation now directed to the Corinthians, in that along the way, part of this discipline will obviously be the suppression of certain things they could do for the sake of the other, as Paul has been discussing, but this will have to do with the attainment of a prize, a word we'll see at the very end of the course in Philippians, used to describe the resurrection, right? In Philippians, very explicitly, the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus, setting everything else aside for the sake of that prize. So run that you may obtain it. The description, too, then, of the Christian life as an athletic endeavor. Meaning, I'm not worried about the fact that it's painful. I'm not worried about the fact that it's difficult. I'm not worried about the necessity of renunciation of this or that or the other thing. Run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things, bringing back into the discussion a word we used in chapter 7 regarding sexuality. Self-control is the thing that I'm after, not any particular marital state, but above all, self-control. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air. The comparison to the Olympiad, I think, is also significant because the sports that are most often visible in an ancient city are not Olympic sports. They're things for which you get paid and which are extremely violent, generally. So baiting of various animals, also gladiatorial combat under different rules, with or without weapons, with or without armor, etc. Paul doesn't pick up the most common sport to talk about. He picks up the most ancient, but also the most honorable or pure, in the sense that their Olympics are very much unlike ours in modern times, or maybe like modern Olympics when they first began, where they truly were amateurs. I mean, they were people that, this guy sells insurance, but he also runs really fast. He's competing for America, right? Or whatever the case might have been. So the idea here is he picks sports in which competition has, as it were, a purer motive than certain other sports with which people may have actually been more familiar. There are 4 sets of games. The most famous ones are the Olympics, but Corinth actually has its own games called the Isthmian Games, because Corinth is on an isthmus between the Peloponnesus and Attica. So Corinth has its own games, and in those games you would have runners. But I think I told you on Monday, the equivalent of the 200-meter dash is so important that the Olympiad, the set of 4 years, gets named after the winner. Right? So the next 4 years, officially, everything is named after you. So there's a really great honor, but the idea here is that even that honor itself fades, goes away. The leaves shrivel, right? So you are running, you're in an honorable contest, but the prize is eternal, or specifically here, imperishable. Imperishable, right? We say this when we have, what season is this? Is it Easter season? Where in the proper preface, we may love those things which are unseen. There's a season where the proper preface, you say at the end, I think it says in LSB, like the crown that does not fade, but I don't like that, so I say the crown that fadeth not away. The crown that fadeth not away. That's what you're pursuing. That's the prize you're seeking. Is it Lent? I don't know. It's getting esoteric, and I'm out of my depth. I don't know. Whatever's in front of my face, I say those words. But I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. I think there's something a little complex about speaking in the first person singular, because it's all getting a little more subtle than when he speaks in the second person. For instance, why does he bring up his body specifically as an opponent of himself here? So he doesn't say, for instance, but I discipline my spirit, or but I discipline my soul. Because I think what he's trying to say in exemplary fashion is that the body and its appetites present a greater danger to him than other parts of him that he might have talked about, might have brought up. Now, how would that pertain to some of the things that we've been into? Well, the body of the man in chapter 5 is what is leading him to do what's heinous. The body in chapter 7 is what may or may not have the capacity for self-control. The body wants to eat meat and ate and knows it can do it, and so just wants to do it and isn't considering anything else. So the body here is not evil, but it is certainly more dangerous in the sense that an actual rifle is more dangerous than an air rifle, or more dangerous than a toy gun, right? It doesn't have to be evil, but it's more dangerous. It can do things that other parts of you won't necessarily. Okay. So he brings that up, and there is a subtlety to speaking in this first person, because they have to think, okay, so that's what you do. Is that what I'm supposed to do? I think necessarily when you speak in the third person, it's implicit. Okay? That's why when people constantly speak in the first person, we get tired of them, because they're constantly, at least implicitly, holding themselves up as interesting, relevant, important, authoritative, and it's boring at the least, right? So implicit, though, in this use of the first person is what is most dangerous to me is actually my body. But I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be, athletic word here, disqualified. Kicked out of the race. Again, I mean this sincerely, in the same sense that I meant it sincerely with celibacy with Roman Catholics. I don't know what a Calvinist, I'm sure there's some explanation. Maybe somebody in here used to be a Calvinist. I don't know what a Calvinist does with lest I should be disqualified. Is he joking? What do they say, Andy? You were a Calvinist.
I don't know in this verse, because he's, they may apply to just as being a pastor, perhaps. But usually the way they talk about any kind of warning, like whether it's here or in Hebrews, is they wouldn't call it a joke, which is how we kind of maybe would phrase it, like, well, he's suggesting, but that it's that God is using that warning to keep, they can't really lose their faith, be disqualified, whatever, and God uses that warning to keep them in the faith. But it's not a real, I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying that's how I explain it. That's usually the route they go, though. That's the most common I've heard.
Yeah, in which case it sounds sort of insincere on God's part to warn about something.
That can't really happen.
I could warn my children about the danger of their driving like a Maserati, but it's not really a problem any of us are going to have. Okay. Anything else on chapter 9 before we go on? Because in 10, he's going to shift the discussion to the Exodus and also to, as Dwight brought up yesterday, the Exodus as well as to the Lord's Supper. Brian.
So concerning the athletic metaphor,
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. That's really insightful. That this is something that the Corinthians would be acquainted with, especially deep in their own history.
Mm-hmm.
What I wonder about is, surely they have an understanding in their culture of, the body and its passions and its lusts getting disordered or becoming a controlling influence over a person's life and
Yeah.
into vice.
Yeah.
And so what's significant difference is Paul, or what is significantly different about what Paul is saying here in not towards just obtaining maybe an earthly or a human goal, but a heavenly, right? Is it, so you know what I'm saying? Like if they have maybe already an understanding of like the weakness of flesh and the superiority of spirit, so how does St. Paul help them to understand that the aim that they're going for is distinct from what they had before?
I think the significance of what he's doing is to say that there is an aim, that I'm not asking you to do difficult things for just sort of some stupid reason or my own delight in getting you to do what I want you to do or something. That the aim involves resurrection and that there are dangers on the way to resurrection. Ergo, here are some sacrifices that I've had to make in order not to be myself disqualified. I think the importance there is that there is an aim in the same sense that if I say, we had this giant townships in Pennsylvania, that's like a municipality, so it's kind of like the city, but it's not called a city. The city built this giant stadium for sports down the hill from my church, and kids were there in numbers, even from other states, at like 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday to play lacrosse and soccer and whatever. And I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna do what those coaches do, and I'm just gonna say, if you don't come to confirmation class, you're done. You miss 2 confirmation classes, you're done, because you don't care. And it worked a lot better than being nice, because then they just all kept coming. Because I thought, look what they do, and that doesn't matter at all, and the parents pay for it. So I'm just going to say, confirmation class is free. I give you Luther's Small Catechism, but if you miss 2 classes, you're done. And it worked. And so it's like sports helps, I think, people understand that there's a goal to this stuff, that it's not just random requirements that the church made up or something,
I was thinking a bit about our conversation yesterday on mortal meetings and Paul talking about physically his body.
Yeah.
Doesn't this kind of fit in with, there's that temptation, I think, to just write off all sins as, well, because all sins equally damned, they're all equally bad. But Paul recognizes, right, discipline of the body is important because sins you commit outwardly are manifestly more harmful and destructive than just sins.
Yeah, and it relates to the idea that the one who is sexually immoral sins against his own body, and that is injurious in a way that, yelling or something is actually not to the person. And I think that you see that interplay between sin in the body and change in the spirit or the soul in people that go from, I got a phone too early in my life, now I'm addicted to porn, now I want to become a woman, because that transformation really only occurs through the idea of gateway drug is not at all, I think, stupid. I don't think you have to assign it to any one particular substance. But the idea that permission for the body to do one thing will be permission for the body to do lots of other things. And that if I don't give the kid the capacity to feel addiction through sugar addiction or TV addiction, that's gonna help him not become addicted to watching, porn, and then addicted to trying to figure out what his sexuality is and just being horribly confused. I'm saying that confusion is way downstream from lots of other things, and especially lots of other things pertaining to sins against the body, destruction of the body. Yeah. Yeah, so the mortal venial sin distinction, totally fine, but yeah, not all sins are actually created equal. And Christians will kind of rush to say that homosexuality is just like any other sin, and that's actually not what Paul is saying in Romans 1. He's saying this is a particularly obvious example of the grievous nature of idolatry. So it's actually, the reason I'm saying this is because it's not just like everything else. Yeah, go ahead.
Our Lutheran fathers used to talk about like the sixth commandment with chastity, modesty / shame, and moderation, because they understood that if you can't moderate yourself like in food and drink, or like video games, to use like, then how are you gonna moderate yourself when it comes to the lust of the flesh in other areas? If you can't practice it in one area, it's not gonna happen in others.
Yeah, I think that they were more perceptive than we are in understanding sort of how these things fit together. That's why, for instance, the hymnody will often talk about nighttime and the dangers of nighttime, right? Which sounds kind of like naive, or, well, they didn't have electricity, so they were scared of Sasquatch or something, but I think they understood that the body changes at night and it's kind of more open at night to a variety of things that are bad for you. Yeah. Or, nothing good happens after 9 p.m. or whatever your parents said. They were right,
This is why it's important for us to return to the devotional discipline, whether it be Lent or Advent or whatever other time, and not as Lutherans to mock it, because self-control simply in eating transfers to self-control in the Christian life. And so when Lutherans on the one hand mock Christian devotion, fasting, bodily preparation, whatever, when we mock it, and then we elevate pure nonsense like the color of the vestments and have arguments for days and days and days, ordinary people are saying, what is going on? Or the Christian faith is nonsense, or so as a Lutheran, we're generally mocking Lent in a way, even as we're participating in it. And so to return to a physical Christian discipline, whether it's more prayer or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I think that Luther's saying certainly find outward discipline or training, depending on your translation. There's a lot of presumption behind that, which is fine for Luther in Luther's time, right? But the idea that there is discipline in any realm of life in our time is not an assumption or presumption we should or ought to make. And so I don't want to skip past fasting when I'm teaching about the Lord's Supper, because it is very powerful to fast before partaking of the Lord's Supper, which I was taught without irony to do in the Episcopal Church. And then you get to the Lutheran Church and they do make fun of all the stuff that they do. And it's like, well, then why are you doing this? Like, if you're going to say the church year is just, it's either kind of like a nerd subject, or it's something that it's just sort of like, it has bearing on what's in the bulletin, but not on my life. Like, I'm just pigging out in Lent just like I do in August or whatever. Then don't ask me to do it. And I'm just speaking psychologically, but maybe this is helpful to you. I psychologically never once, as an Episcopalian, thought that I was saving myself because I was told, don't eat before you take Holy Communion, eat soup for dinner in Lent. And this is a completely theologically degenerate church, but they still have these practices, especially Anglo-Catholic parishes. and they just tell you to do it, and you do it, and it's helpful.
And it's discipline, and discipline is a fair virtue.
I never once thought I am my own savior or anything.
So when we observe pre-Lent, and then we go in the parish hall and we all eat donuts, and we mock fasting in the name of Christ, and then we read on Ash Wednesday, when you fast. We're making a disconnect between the Christian faith and life.
And life, yeah. And that's the killer for our folks, because Monday through Saturday, they're not familiar with any of the stuff that goes on. The stuff on Sunday is totally disconnected from Monday through Saturday. And that's just cognitively confusing and not helpful. The more helpful and the more connections you can make, I think the better for everybody. It makes more sense. Jared, do you have a hand?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
This text is included in pre-Lent. So we had banter last night about the 1 year and the 3 year series, but this particular text is the typical proof text in the confessions for fasting and bodily preparation, and it's included at Septuagesimae, I think.
Yep.
Or it's either that or Sexagesima, which is helpful. So what's been a little confusing for me, Paul's still in the same argument about the eating of meat, which is a 3-chapter span. But when he started, he was concerned about other people who are weak.
Yeah.
And now he is concerned about my weakness.
Yeah.
And warning, and pretty soon he's going to say, be careful if you think you stand, lest you fall.
Yeah.
He's very clearly not any longer talking about other weak people, but about me who think I'm strong, but who are actually a lot weaker than I am. And that shift in the span of 3 chapters came very subtly for Paul.
Yes, because he doesn't tell you where he's going, but he finds in this inane little issue so much to discuss, because it has to do I care about the congregation or mostly about myself? Do I think that I am what I am because I know more than other people? Do I presume that I'm doing great and I don't have to check my weight and my speed and the other sort of indicators that an athlete would check? Do I think that I'm somehow different and not subject to any of the dangers that everyone except Joshua and Caleb were subject in the Exodus? Let's get into 10. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, and this whole chapter is going to make a lot more sense if you think that Paul wrote Hebrews. Okay, just saying. Yeah, I know. Okay, all right. But I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Baptized into Moses here meaning sharing a destiny with him. Right, in the same sense that those baptized into Christ share a destiny with him, right, sharing with him a death like his, that they may share with him in a resurrection like his. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased. You remember from chapter 7 how he said that my concern should be to do what is pleasing to the Lord. With most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. He's just going over the story and reminding you that the God of that story is the same God whom you worship. Right? Now, these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Something to note about that word is that in 10:6, this is when we talk about typology in the Bible, these are types for us, tupoi. So the typology extends not only to the relationship between Christ in the Old Testament and Christ in the New, it also extends for Paul to lots of other things. These are types of us. Okay? Example is sort of an over-interpretation in that way, because yes, it is an example, but if I am disqualified through poor discipline of my body, then it's a type, and I'm the antitype, right? So I don't want to become the antitype of those overthrown in the wilderness, right? Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. You're going to notice that the sins that he's been talking about in Corinth are sins that he finds also in the people of Israel in the Exodus, right? Idolatry, sexual immorality. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, again as types in 11, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands. Now who might that be? Someone with lots of knowledge. Someone who, when Paul said, "You who are strong," said, "Yes, that's me." Knowledge, strength, ability to persevere, right? So he hears that, he thinks, yes, I'm strong, I will condescend to the weak. Let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation, I think this is a verse that gets turned into God doesn't give you anything that you can't handle. Paul says something slightly different. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. That assertion is on the basis of the Old Testament. That is, that I'm using the Old Testament, primarily Bible stories, to learn what it is that could be a problem for me too, or for us too, right? This, I think, is the wisdom in the way that we usually taught the Bible in schools historically. You still get it in books like 100 Bible Stories, where the primary thing that we wanted people to know was not only memorization of chapter and verse, but primarily, and before that, and through that, and after that, Bible stories. That I could say Caleb, and they would know who that is, and that he didn't fall, and that he inherited Hebron, right? And if I know that, then I can work with that, both homiletically, but also in any setting, and say, well, see what happened. Well, what was the difference when they found the grapes of Eshcol between most of the spies and the others? Well, most were terrified of what they saw. Some held on to what God said. Very simple lesson, but very powerful, right? So Paul's doing that. He's taking a well-known story of the Exodus. You know they fell. You know what happened with them. And then saying, look, these are types for you. These are things to learn from. It's not only something that happened back then, it's something that could happen to you. Let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. You're not going through something that's never happened before. I love to think of it that way, because I hear Elon Musk telling me that the robot that he's making that's going to do food delivery, he's going to set so it can only go 5 miles an hour. So, and then Elon says this and he laughs nervously. He has very poor public speaking style. He doesn't enunciate, and he's just kind of like muttering and then laughing nervously. But he says, it's only going to be like 5 miles an hour. So you can run away from it. And I don't think anyone has ever had to deal with this before. But Paul's saying to me, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. So Maybe they were just goat demons back then, and now they're going to be robots. But it's not unprecedented. I find that very comforting. Okay? God is faithful. So this is the difference. He doesn't say, you're not going to handle it. He says, God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your, we have in English, ability. Now, what is my ability exactly? In 13, beyond what you are able or capable, hodunestha, but he will create poiese with the temptation, kaiten ekbasin. And ekbasis is an escape out of something, right? The escape. So he doesn't say, you're going to handle it. Your children are all going to die in a car accident tomorrow, and you're going to be able to handle it. He says you will have an escape. This is a little bit different, okay? Because the idea that you're handling it, I think, just sounds wildly unrealistic. The idea that there is somehow an escape from this is different. Think about the difference here, right? Can Joseph handle it if he has to stay in prison for the rest of his life? No, because then actually, if Joseph stays in prison for the rest of his life, then he dies in a hole just like his brothers originally intended. God provides an escape. Okay? Can Joseph handle it if every day this older, richer woman says to him, please sleep with me? No. But strangely, God provides an escape by putting him in prison. So even evil things are worked for good, but they're not worked as Joseph can handle it. Joseph can handle it. I mean, he tries. He says no. He doesn't sleep with her, but God provides an escape. That's a little bit different and depends upon God than saying God won't give you anything you can't handle. It's a half-truth. It's actually only half that verse, so it's really dangerous. Because then it places all the weight of the situation on your psychological capacities. And that, I think, is very dangerous, very uncertain. Who knows what's going on inside of you? And then it also makes the Christian faith, and this is something I sort of despise about modern preaching, it makes it a psychological question. And that's not, I'm not actually proclaiming merely psychological truths when I'm preaching. I'm saying Jesus is actually coming back, or you will actually be alive because of him, or whatever else the case might be. It's not simply a psychological truth, like if you think about things differently, you'll feel better. That is true. Like, if you don't focus on being miserable every day, life is easier to deal with, but that's not the Christian faith. So the gospel is not a proclamation of psychology. It's a proclamation concerning reality. Okay? So if you stop with psychology in the middle of the verse, you've really missed the point. Go ahead.
This concept of escape, that Greek word, I think it also can be translated the result of your life, of the patterns of your life. So it's not just like, oh, I'll give you a little out, but rather return to the paradigm that you've been following as a child of God. And so I think that has an important aspect to it. It's used in Hebrews 13:7, for instance, in that way. Be an imitator of the result of our way of life.
Remember your leaders who spoke to you the word of God. You have seen the result or outcome of their conduct, tes anastrophes. So the conduct or pattern of life is the anastrophe. The ekbasis is the where this comes out, where's the door out.
Yeah, the result. That's the way I read it anyway. The result is ekbasin.
The pattern of life that you're talking about is anastrophe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So up to this point, we've been talking about the conflict of righteous Christian life versus temptations, bodily temptations,
Yeah.
spiritual temptations
Yeah.
towards sin.
Yeah.
And so this isn't, I don't know, I've had a hard time understanding this with regard to life circumstances, even personal tragedy, unless we're talking about the temptations that come along with those, temptations towards godliness in some way, despising God or so, when we're talking about an escape, we're not talking about a change in your life circumstances will soon be coming, like the fortune cookie says. We're talking about how the Lord will preserve you through, right? That suffering.
And it could be a change in life circumstance. It could be like Joseph. Could be. It could be Paul let down in a basket.
Yeah.
Or
So that point is well taken. The change in life circumstances, right, wasn't so much so that the prison was better than the palace, but that there he would escape from. Like you were saying,
Potiphar's wife, yeah. Or it could be, Paul asks 3 times for the thorn in the flesh to be removed, and Jesus tells him, "My power is made perfect in weakness." This is how my power is exhibited in your life, is in your weakness, right? That's the ekbasis in this particular case, not that Paul's life changes right then, but that he now realizes what this is for or how this is working.
Yeah, I think this is why, like in our prayers for the sick, the chief thing we ask for is that their faith may be preserved, that they be delivered from the temptations of the evil one. And then, we ask for, healing. But it's chiefly that we're remain in their faith.
Right. Yeah, because the faith can be assaulted by what happens to the body, and especially by circumstance, and that's all totally understandable. It's very humanly understandable why almost everybody's. I won't be understandable, so I'll just wait for a second. It's not at all random or hard to grasp why, when people pray spontaneously or request prayer, it's almost always about the fourth petition of the Lord's Prayer. Almost always. A very rare person is possessed by a fervent desire to have the gospel preached or something. Mostly it's stuff that happened and stuff that, happened in my body. I think that's fine as long as it doesn't stop there and act like the only problems you have are bodily problems. I don't know if this is really possible. I'm not louder than the sawzall. That's the problem. Yeah, no, we're basically, we probably just have to knock off early if they have to do their sawzall. Other things about the body spirit interrelationship but yeah, I don't think the prayer for faith to be preserved is Pollyanna-ish or sort of you're ignoring the circumstances of the body. You're recognizing how much they're interconnected.
And with it also includes the part that they may return praising you, just like the Psalms.
Yeah. Let's listen to a little more exhortation, and then he's going to get into the Lord's Supper. Okay? So from 14, therefore, my beloved, not a phrase that he's used before or that he uses often, unlike John. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation, weak communion? Is it not a communion in the blood of Christ, right? So the question of the reality of the Lord's physical presence in the supper is not a question. It's not a New Testament question, right? He's asking rhetorically, this is the blood of Christ, so obviously. Is it not a communion in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a communion in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, this is why I never get too upset about individual cups. even though I don't use it myself, because we don't do the one bread. Maybe you do, I don't know. I mean, Jared's doing excommunication, so that's the first time I ever. So, is anyone doing the one bread? You got one unleavened loaf, is anybody doing that? Outstanding, okay.
Well, we actually do because we have a small number of communicants, so I just get like a big celebrant host that breaks into like 30 pieces, and that's enough.
Because there is one bread. This also tells you maybe something about the size of the congregation. How many people are actually in this church? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices communicants or participants in the altar, sharers? What do I imply then? That food sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagans sacrifice, now what precisely is that? Yeah, it's the Gentiles. Something to notice here is that the New Testament uses the word the nations or the Gentiles, both in, we might say, an ethnic sense, but here in a really purely religious sense, because the ethnically Gentile Christians are not Gentiles in this sense. Yeah? Okay, so you find that very early on in Christianity. That's Martin. Okay. So, no, I imply that what Gentiles sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be communicants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot share in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? Is this a contradiction of what he said earlier? You guys are pastors. It seemed like there was no power in it earlier, like it was nothing. It didn't matter, right? Now it's like you're somehow worshiping demons or sharing in things of demons by eating the food. Okay. Yeah, Andy.
Is it the setting? Like, I mean, there's a big difference between eating meat that was sacrificed to an idol when it's in a marketplace, rather than going to the temple for worship, to worship the false god and sit down at the worship feast.
So part of this has to do, I think, with Paul's style, where you observed he's kind of moving around, but we didn't know he was going to do that, and why is he here and why is he there? Remember the scenario that he imagined between the strong and the weak. It was the weak guy walks past where? Not your house, not the marketplace, but the temple, and sees you eating the food. So watch what they're doing. They're not just picking up to go from the halal marketplace. They're going to the Muslim feast and eating the food there. Would you do that? You might be able to order the halal food and eat it at home. Would you go to, we had this at the college I went to, we would have these ecumenical or interfaith things. So what is it, Eid al-Fitr? When do they break their fast and they have a big meal?
Or at the
End of Ramadan. I don't know. Whatever. I didn't go to it. But many of the other Christians did. And I thought, I'm not happy Ramadan's over. I don't believe in Ramadan. So it is something different, I think, where you eat the food. I do think that's right. I do think that matters. Because if I go into the temple and I'm eating with the pagans say, you're one of us. Watch how he clarifies. He could have been clearer, though. He could have stated this up front and said, here are the two scenarios. But this is what he does. Yeah.
If you go back to chapter 8,
Yeah.
I'd at least suggest that he would leave even going to the temple open to Christian knowledge and freedom. And because in chapter 8, in verse 8, 9, that area, food will not commend us to God, nor neither the worse. If we do not eat, nor better if we do. But take care lest this liberty of yours somehow becomes a stumbling block to lead. For if someone sees you who have knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he's weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? So my eating in a dining temple is in accord with my knowledge and liberty. Here, in that.
Isn't he communing with demons, though?
He might be. But just like a weak person would be, so somebody who's weak, who doesn't have this knowledge, would be dining with demons if he doesn't have strength, if he doesn't have knowledge. What I think Paul is saying here is, hey, you guys have knowledge, or think you do.
Yeah.
You probably don't have as much as you think you do. You're not as strong as you think you are. And you're going into scenarios where you are sinning and kidding yourself by your theology that you're strong, that you are committing idolatry, and you gotta get out of it. You're technically free. I mean, it's amazing. You're technically free to leave it, but you better not do it. You're not strong. But I think he's saying that very subtly to them, because he knows they're not going to hear it very favorably.
You don't think the demons are real?
Of course they're real.
I mean, these specific demons in the temple when I eat their food. I think that's the issue. Is there something going on in a pagan temple? Or is it just it's just nothing? It's like I ate the hotel breakfast today, like.
So what was just introduced, of course, is this language of communion,
Yeah.
right? So
And that wasn't present in 8. So in 8 it was just there's food, can I eat it?
now we're talking about cultic eating,
Yeah.
participation in sacred rites.
Yeah, good. Cultic eating.
And it's demonic.
Yeah.
It's not just a rite, like
Yeah.
going to the shrine for a pancake breakfast. Well, maybe that would be.
Can I eat, if the Masons have a pancake breakfast, can I eat it? If it's in the fire hall, go ahead.
Well, I mean, you talk about daily bread, the fourth petition, in terms of all the stuff my body needs, but you also talked about the greater daily bread, the Lord's Supper. And so, depending on how you talk about it, you can mean either, right? So Paul is using it in both senses, as far as, eating at a temple.
Specifically about the Lord's Supper, in contrast to other religious eating. Not just food generally, but other food consumed in what we would describe as a religious context or setting.
Yeah. But you made the distinction before. He's just talking about eating, and now he's talking about the Lord's Supper. Well, isn't he really talking about the Lord's Supper as well in the first? Because they're talking about eating meat sacrificed to demons.
Okay. In 8, I think he starts out more, let's say, abstractly with there's food that you can only get really from a temple somehow. Then, without explaining what he's doing, he introduces this scenario where you're sitting in a temple and somebody walks past. And he says that would be a big problem for the guy that walks past who's going to wind up, sinning. He's introduced a new element to the story without telling you that he's doing so, very common for Paul, by saying, actually, you need to think about food not so much abstractly, but in connection with where you are partaking of it. So now he brings up the Lord's Supper. I think he's getting progressively more concrete. Go ahead.
I think going back to your question, do we believe these demons are real? I think this is very helpful even when teaching the first commandment, that these other gods people are worshiping, they're not just nothing. They're demons. Like this is something's really going on, and I think it's important for especially we have people coming from other religions into our church or other things. Like it's demonic activity they're participating in, and no matter how nice it is at the Mormon temple or whatever, it's demonic. And if we don't see that, I think we don't understand what they're coming out of or what they're going through. Or,
What's actually going on?
Helpful to know, because I just don't know what's going on here, but it seems to me like there's a civil and a pagan religious element that is more tightly wound together than what we're used to. This would be like going to a Broncos game where they also worship demons there, or that it's fundamentally different.
None of this is hypothetical, I think.
I don't think so either. I mean, Christians have these questions. I mean, should I shop at Target?
Yes.
They transgenderize the bathrooms. Can I go and get bacon from Target if they have transgender bathrooms? Well, yeah, you probably can. And then, okay, the Christians now are being encouraged to go to the library that has the transgender story hour. Well, I can go to Target, but I probably shouldn't go to transgender story hour. Or in the name of Christian love, we have a Denver Pride Fest gay parade. And if you're a good Christian, you'll go down there with your little children and you will support them because we're loving. And I don't think they're abstract questions.
This is where the aim thing, I think, is so important, because I think this has often been read by American Christians as just random rules or the need to preserve a Christian subculture. That's obviously stupid. I don't care whether we have Christian companies for everything and a Christian plumber and that obviously doesn't matter on its face. The reason things like this matter is because some things about life destroy faith and confuse. That's why it matters. So am I going to teach my son to waste his time caring about the NFL when the NFL hates him and hates my country? No, I'm not going to do that. It's at best a waste of time. At best. Right? So, and it's not because I'm like legalistic, it's because I don't want him to waste his life.
Simple. You're still getting Paul's saying, but you'll have to use wisdom on this.
Yeah,
totally. I'm not going to make a law about going to Broncos games or going to Target, but you should be aware that there are scenarios that are fundamentally demonic, and you're probably not strong enough to deal with them.
Yeah.
So flee from idolatry.
Yeah.
But you're technically free. You can go to Target.
I don't find that caveat helpful because it's just not how Proverbs phrases wisdom. It's free in the sense that I need the individual to figure out for himself, instead of listening to a list I gave him, how not to be stupid in life. On the other hand, I need him to understand that it's actually dangerous, not that I am technically free. Like I get that, but I don't find it the way that the Bible talks about gaining wisdom. Okay.
Yeah, part of the trouble, at least for me, in my understanding, is that, like Jared said, we have this notion of the division between sacred and secular.
Right.
When in fact, the demons are entirely all over they're all over the place in secular society.
Yeah, right.
And especially nowadays, consumerism and your consumer habits are basically your cultic worship.
Okay, right, yeah.
And that's probably why it feels like you, like Jared was saying, you run into situations where you just can't win. Because the people are telling you, when you shop at us, at our store, or participate in our products, then you are in fact supporting these demonic things.
Yeah. Because I can't go, there are not enormous portions of my daily life that are just totally non-theological, right? So if I go and I have to participate in some ritual surrounding like Black Lives Matter, I have to accept a certain telling of original sin that involves me being the problem as a white male. And it's wrong. I'm sorry, it's wrong. You possess original sin by virtue of being descended from Adam, not by virtue of being a certain kind of Japhethite or something, right? So that's just wrong, so I can't do that. That's a religious, everything is theological if I think about it enough. You just had the luxury, the sacred secular division is just kind of like, that's really only possible in a Christianized society. In the same sense that, Christian medieval cities are different from ancient cities, and that in an ancient city, the temple and the forum are all in the same place. In most medieval cities, there are 2 major squares, one for the cathedral and one for City Hall, because really only Christians understand that secular things have limits, right? But if they're not Christians out there, then they don't recognize that. So they're not going to let me have just my non-theological consumer experiences. That's over, you know.
But still, you know, from a cultic worship perspective, that's a little bit different. There is a little bit of a difference than just dealing with things out in the culture, whether we're going to go to Target or Chuck E. Cheese or whatever. I mean, you know, so there is the Masonic temple, you know, or there is the, you know, whatever. And so I'm particularly thinking about ancient Israel, and the bigger issue with ancient Israel was syncretism. They didn't completely abandon Yahweh, but they added Baal worship or whatever, you know, worship to other gods to that. You know, so I think that's what I see going on here in 1 Corinthians 8-10 is more of an issue of, you know, there's kind of a problem with syncretism, which specifically has to do with demon worship in...
You're right, yeah, and I think that's, I mean, obviously if you're looking at your people, the stuff that on its face, I mean, it's sort of like a sermon on why the Mormons are wrong can be good every once in a while, but the major problem isn't that everyone is just going to desert to something that's obviously wrong. Like, you're going to turn into a god and get a planet, blah, blah, blah. Somebody will be attracted by that. Most people, the danger for us is syncretism, because that's what comes up over and over again. And that's even what Paul's rhetorical question is asking. Can you do both? Think about it. Because that's what they want to do. Go ahead.
Just what you think about this guy. I'm trying to figure out the question that these people were asking and that Paul is answering in this whole spread. Do you think that they were asking the question, if we're going to be faithful Christians in Corinth, do we have to be Amish? Should we just check out of life entirely? And that Paul's answer is something like, no, but you better be really careful.
I think that the reason that these questions come up is because there's still something worthwhile in participating in the civic life of a pagan city for at least some of them. People who are slaves aren't going to care like people who actually have something to lose. You know, think about the phenomenon of theological liberalism in our church. Why does it pop up where it does? Because it's usually in a place far away from where being Missouri Synod is obvious. And then it's also generally in a place where you have something to lose if you're too different. So you don't want to be too weird, too Missouri Synod, because that's weird, that's bad. Everybody else is Catholic, or nobody else goes to church, or whatever. So you alter yourself to make yourself more comfortable in life. It's syncretism. They want both. And the problem is, their life is wrapped up, there's no difference in ancient Corinth between worship of pagan gods and the existence of Corinth as a city. Yeah. So, I mean, my overwhelming sense is that we're back there now. Yeah.
And so he's saying, no, don't move out of Corinth.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, and I mean, I'm particular about the Amish. They don't. They simply make collective decisions about what they're going to participate in. I really think we should do the same thing, even if you still end up driving automobiles. Because this is what we were talking about yesterday, and Adrian's like, do we have any way to? No, we don't. We don't have a way to make practical decisions that would help guide people, like, except congregation by congregation. So that's what they're doing. They're not, if the Amish were opting out, they would run something more like what the Hutterites do in like Montana, the Dakotas, prairie provinces, where they live on a commune. The Amish don't actually do that. They're participating on a limited basis as discerned generally regionally, not even congregation by congregation, what are we going to do? And if you don't want to do this, then you leave. But if you do want to do this, these are the rules. Yes, it's legal. Yes, they get into lots of legalism. They're Anabaptists, of course they do. But the basic principle of collective discernment of wisdom, I don't really, just seems Christian to me.
Yeah, no, right. Well, I mean, but I think that's just answering the question. So I agree with you. I think we're getting to a point where Christians are going to ask, can I still be a Christian and live in Denver?
Yeah, right.
And Paul's answer probably is going to be
yeah, no, I don't, yeah, and I don't actually think the question is about moving.
well, because like you said, living in Corinth and being in and around demon worship is inseparable.
Yeah. Right, but what I'm saying is the only people who are actually really worried about that or have some stake in the system are people who aren't slaves, who are doing well, who have plenty of pagan friends, right? And this comes up in the martyrdom accounts. Cyprian is an unusually well-educated man for a Christian bishop. Mostly the Christians don't get the high flyers. Cyprian, Augustine, these are exceptions. So when Cyprian's about to die, he's imprisoned, and all these friends come to him who also have 3 names because they're actually citizens too, unlike most of the Christians, and they say, "This is stupid. What are you doing?" Right? And the accusation made against Cyprian in both martyrdom accounts that are trial accounts is you have abandoned, mori Romani, Roman mores. You have betrayed your class, your people, by doing this. Questions like this happen for wealthy people, well-educated people, noble people, right? People who have something to lose in this world. They don't come up for somebody like Paul because he already lost all that. Paul gets problems like this. What can I participate in and what can I not participate in? Not with pagans, but with his own people. But it's a question of being entangled with people. And the wealthier you are, for instance, the more you have to lose in civic entanglement. Go ahead, Dave.
And in today, you might say these things happen with people who have good jobs or who work for big companies who are entangled and have something to lose.
And it's going to come up more and more for our farmers with who owns the farmland that they work, because they probably don't, or don't like their grandfathers did, right? So the boss wants me to do this, Yeah, it's entanglement. And yeah, you can't move away from it because Paul says if you wanted to get away from it outside the church, you can put it out of the church. But if you want to get away from it outside the church, you would have to go out of the world. Yeah, so moving is not the issue. That's why, I don't see, Paul's not doing, bless you, Paul's not doing like if you guys just move into what's now Macedonia, when there's nobody there, then you're going to be fine. That's not the issue. But the question of what you do when you live in Denver is the issue. Yeah, you can live in Denver. In fact, you're probably going to overtake a neighborhood eventually because they don't, our elites do not reproduce. So you can just go occupy the neighborhood and just wait. It worked for Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn. The question is, when you live there, what are you going to participate in? And Orthodox Jews, for instance, just didn't participate in any of the COVID rules, which they got in trouble for. But they just said, we don't want to do it, so. Anything else on right here? Go ahead, yeah.
Is it possible, so if you bought meat and you took it home to cook it, were you buying meat at like a stall out front of the
It's all the same. So in the forum, you have statuary and you have a rostrum for public speeches and you have various temples. You also have, like in Rome specifically, you have a big market hall with vendors, and that's because all the stuff is all available in the same place.
So is it possible that there was also the ancient restaurant where you, instead of buying meat that you could take home, You could buy the same
Yeah, they had walk-up
and eat it there,
food trucks.
and that might be allowable, but going to the temple and eating it when it's a part of a pagan ritual might be utterly unacceptable.
Because on the one hand, your brother's going to see you, and he doesn't know what's going on, and because two, you're not as strong as you think. Very perceptive. You're not as strong as you think. Yeah. Anything else right now? Are you guys going to move somewhere now, or?
I just, these questions for me have bothered me for years, that probably Corinth is just so the beast that to buy the food, you are somehow funding the beast, but there isn't any other food to buy, so fine enough.
And Paul's focus is not what ours often is, where it's like individual consumer decisions. It's what's good for the congregation. So it doesn't have to do so much with like, my tax dollars go to, or my consumer spending goes to. You might make that decision for all kinds of reasons, right? You might say, well, I have to shop at Walmart. I don't have a choice. I don't have any more money. And I live in a high cost of living, whatever, right? The issue is not so much about where your stuff is going and that those dollars wouldn't get polluted. The issue is the pollution and destruction of the congregation and you individually through syncretism. That's also why I think collective decision-making, just on this is my natural argument, I don't have a Bible verse right now, it would be much more helpful if people heard about this in sermons, but also if there were some sort of guidance on what to do collectively, because it's just easier to do things when you know other people are doing them than if it's like, well, I'm particularly motivated and I did all this research and I got the LifeSite news list of all the abortion funding companies and I don't buy from them, but this guy over here who's a nice guy didn't do that research and he's still buying from all that stuff. That's dispiriting, and consumer decisions, like I cannot ensure that every dollar I've ever spent hasn't gone to some evil purpose after I spend it.
It's just also ironic. I will stop giving money to church because the pastor said this minute thing that I didn't like. We use blue paraments instead of violet, and I'm not giving any more. And meanwhile, you go out and fund the world, and it's all intriguing.
Some in here believe that you were justly judged for using blue, but
I'd like it just to make you all angry. It's really pretty.
I do just like blue better than violet, but whatever, that's fine. Okay, let's make sure we go through the last two paragraphs here before we break for lunch, or for the day, really. All things are lawful, you've heard that slogan before, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Okay, David, this does go to your question. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, polumenon, the place where meat is sold. That's all that means. Okay, so he's not saying go into the temple and eat, but if you get it from the market, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, this answers to some extent your question from the other day about your relationship to non-Christians and eating. Eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. And, because if you really want to be worried about this, the American food industry is heavily attuned with Jewish dietary law. So all your stuff has been offered to something that is not the true God already before you consume it. That's why it's got the K on it, or the, yeah. Okay. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice to Hashem, Allah, whatever, then do not eat it. I'm happy that finally at the end, Paul is being somewhat clear. It is helpful. I've been worried about it for a while here. Okay. Do not eat it. For the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience, I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my freedom or liberty, he'elutheria mu, why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? Is this clear enough for anybody? Do you have remnant questions? He's going to close it out. He's going to say, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense. Okay. Give no offense. Do not set a stone of stumbling. Let's say really literally. To Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ.
Yeah, so the return to the scenario of being invited to an unbeliever's house.
Yes.
You know, all food is food. God created it for our benefit and good.
Yeah.
He's like, if it's said before you, nobody says anything, you can eat.
Yeah.
But if he says something, don't eat. Not for your own sake, because it's still food to you.
Right.
But rather now, his conscience is at stake.
Yeah.
Because he's made it, a doctrinal issue.
Because now he thinks Allah or Hashem is the same as Christ.
Right.
No problem.
So now this has become not just about eating and drinking or having friendship with each other. Now this is about the gods.
Yeah. So you have at least let's say, I was going to say 3, but let's say 4 places. One is the church. That's where I have communion with the body of Christ and with the blood of Christ. Unambiguous. The other 3 places are ambiguous places. One of them is the temple. Maybe I could go there and eat. Maybe I'm not as great as I think. And maybe somebody walks past and it becomes a big problem. Ambiguous. More ambiguous than that is the meat market, where I'm picking up something. That could be okay. Most ambiguous is somebody else's house. I go there. If he says the magic words, I can't eat, so that he doesn't get confused. If he doesn't say anything, whatever.
So it's like almost you could go along with it. Go over to some Arab tea party and he has some grand prayer of praise to Allah before he gives the American his cup of tea, saying, "This has been blessed by Allah, now you may drink it."
Yeah.
It's almost as if we could either go along with that and deny Christ, or say no, there is Christ, and your Allah is a false God. I don't know if it's helpful for us or maybe not helpful for us to think in terms of, is this a time or a place for Jesus to be seen as distinct from the rest of the world? Like, is this, to use one of these Lutheran cliches, an opportunity to confess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, because you want him to be known as the only God. Yeah.
So should I think of if he tells me that it's been sacrificed to an idol, should I think of that as he's challenging me to eat it? Oh, by the way, this has been offered to an idol, now let's see what you do. Or as a courtesy, he's telling me, or does any of that matter?
I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters if he's messing with you or if he just thinks it's a nice thing to say.
Then you take this all in the reverse. There's many occasions, where somebody just ends up in your house. They're walking their dog by, They say hi. You say we're eating hamburgers. You want to come in. The kids just bring random people home from work to supper. Everything's normal. These kids are fighting. People are scurrying, etc. And then all of a sudden, everyone is singing "Dear Christians, one and all rejoice" around the meal. And so, if there's power in the demonic meals, then we should consider there is power in our meals. Almost this idea that the supper of our Lord extends out with power into our suppers in our homes. You can eat here in our home.
Yes. The Lord's Supper is the summit of life, and the rest of life is on the same mountain.
I know in Corinth, you don't really separate the secular from the religious, but would it be fair to say that he's making a distinction between a pagan host who thinks, oh, it's just food, or could the pagan be thinking, this all comes from Allah or Zeus or whatever? Is that the distinction he's making?
Well, no, I think he's making a distinction between you have a situation where there is an assertion concerning the divine versus where you don't. So the guy's just, he's a lazy Muslim. He doesn't do his prayers. Or he prays, or he does like when Missouri and Wisconsin get together and we have separate prayers, that could be okay silently, I guess, right?
So Adrian's comment is fascinating in context of chapter 10.
Yeah.
Because there's this discussion of the holy meal.
Yeah.
And there's discussion of the unholy meal. So what sanctifies our daily food? If you talk about the Lord's Supper, that's the thing that sanctifies us, that makes us holy. And therefore holy's our daily bread. So the reverse is true. Maybe this is part of Paul's argument that the baseness of the demonic meal demonizes the daily.
Any food may be claimed for the true God through the Word of God and prayer. But when it has been claimed for a false God, I dare not act as if he and the true God have anything in common. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking ritually here because that's what I do. And I'm thinking about Leviticus 10:10, where God tells Aaron to distinguish between the holy and the common or profane, and between the clean and the unclean. And so in my ritual mind, these questions are answered fairly clearly. Okay, earlier in 1 Corinthians, I think maybe 8, it talked about defiling the conscience of the guy who sees you, And so defilement is the movement from ritual cleanness to ritual uncleanness or impurity. And so, participating in, the idol's temple is a power. These things are powers. The movement from clean to unclean or unclean to clean, or from common to holy or holy to common. These are ritual, spiritual powers that affect our lives. And so to look at these things from that way, I think clears up a lot of these questions about, well, what can we do, what can't we, what shouldn't we, and
because the issue is not the food category in Corinth. The thing that I'm trying to preserve is cleanness of conscience.
Yeah, for the ancient Israelites, it was an outward cleanness. The book of Hebrews makes that clear. But for us in the New Testament, it goes not only bodily, but to the soul, to the conscience.
Any unclarity that we still want to resolve, or what is meant by imitate me as I imitate Christ in this specific. What? I don't know anything about that, no. That's why I wrote my dissertation. I wrote my dissertation on that in a religion department, so it was on New Testament. My advisor believed very fervently in knowing Roman and Greek history as the context for the New Testament, which is not all that helpful. I mean, it's somewhat helpful with the Gospels. It's really helpful with Paul. And so that worked really well, but alongside that, I taught basically world religions. I had a Bible course once. I had a couple American religious history classes, but that's also sort of a world religions format. A lot more discussion of Protestant Christianity, for example, but mostly world religions. So you begin to see categories are common, such as defilement, but the definitions vary so widely between Christianity and other things because of the nature of, for instance, conscience in this regard. And also the nature of imitation here. The imitation is not, it's not a specific action, right? So you can see, I would ride the subway from 30th Street station, which got me into the city, up to Temple, and then on the subway, there's always like some black guy who has his hair dyed red, and he has like a scraggly beard, and it'll be like 30 degrees, and he's wearing just like a white garment and like a fez, sort of. And he's doing that because his definition of imitation in Islam involves literal imitation of the appearance of Muhammad. And since Muhammad is reported as having had red hair, he has to dye his hair red, right? And he has to wear the clothing that Muhammad wore. The imitation here is specifically a certain relationship to other people that involves seeking their good primarily rather than my own, or what I could do, or what I want to do. So Paul imitates Christ, not in necessarily speaking Aramaic most of the time, or working on buildings, or wearing the same clothing. He imitates Christ by seeking the salvation of the other, and that's what he's asking the Corinthians to do.
So Christ eats and drinks with sinners, which I think is significant, right? But of course, his presence there, his word there, sanctifies what they are doing and blesses the people. Jesus also spends time with the Samaritans, like at the well, you know, the woman there, John chapter 4. And so is this, what is he talking about? It's like, keep in mind, when it comes to the example of Christ that I am following, be very cognizant of how Jesus associated with people, both Jews and Gentiles, and in his dealings with them. So is that what he's talking about? It's just basically knowing the things that Christ did and how he did them.
Yeah, and so this also concerns the relationship between Paul and the Gospels. Paul presumes not necessarily any particular gospel document or the collection of the four, could be, could not be historically conceivable. But he presumes definite knowledge of what is in there. Jesus' way of life, his handling of food, his handling of relationships with other people, whom he would physically touch, things like that. It presumes it because he doesn't refer to it extensively, and it's basically always offhand, the same way he refers to Old Testament Bible stories, for example. And when it's offhand, you know that he thinks, you guys got this, so you know what I'm talking about. Anything else on food sacrificed to idols? 15 minutes. Do we need 15 minutes more on food sacrificed to idols? This has been fun. I have never taught pastors food sacrificed to idols specifically. So it's fun because you can get into it. It feels a little abstract, but once you start talking about Target, everybody knows what you're talking about. You do, yeah, because I think everyone thinks about questions like this, and that's why Paul spends so much time on it. Because the relationship to the world outside the church is one that's always difficult, but especially because it's so much more difficult than it once was, I think it's a lot more urgent. Yeah. Yep, we're good.